Boss rush is a style of game that I'm surprised there's very few titles in. Boss fights are generally the best parts of games, except the ones that aren't, either because they're hard as nails or because there's a grand spectacle to it all. Either way, they're involved in most memorable moments in games, and Fury, Titan Souls, and Jotun all add fantastic bosses to the gaming scene. I'm happy to say that Grimrush adds 7 more to this collection. There isn't a single fight in the game that I would consider to be objectively bad. Some are certainly better than others, but they're all good for one key reason. They're all fair fights with a nicely rounded difficulty curve. Unfair fights is something I criticised Cuphead for. Majority of that game used randomness and abused the player's lack of knowledge to punish their mistakes. Wally Warble's egg attack is always something I find myself coming back to when thinking about utter bullshit. But going to a part of the game that I did like, Captain Brinybeard's fight, I praise it for increasing the challenge by progressively adding new attacks on top of ones you're already familiar with. This is present in all of Grimrush's bosses, and it's why they were all such a joy to fight. Each of the bosses are split into multiple phases, the first of which is always deceptively simple. Attacks are limited in either variation or speed, giving the player almost complete freedom while learning how the boss is trying to kill them. Then the fight progresses to phase 2, where I'd argue it actually begins. It's the most present against the Bermuda Devil. It initially attacks you with ice type attacks, which travel in a straight line and leave a lingering damage zone. Then it switches it up with electric type attacks, the more traditional bullet hell variants. And I'd bet, after passing these 2 phases, you're familiar with how the attacks work, so when they're combined in the final stage, you know roughly what you're doing. The game strikes a balance of challenging you without ever overwhelming you. It's for this reason that I'd wager anyone can pick up and beat Grimrush if they're determined enough. Bosses don't do a heap of damage per swing, and there's generous healing abilities available if you're really struggling. But these don't mean anything if you're trying for the real challenge, maximizing your score. You don't just lose health when you take damage, you also lose out on some combo. Half of it actually, on top of the damage penalty, so you can't take a lot of hits if you want to be competitive on the leaderboards. Instead, you have to weave through attack patterns and maximize your perfect dodges, as these are awarded points as well. Stamina management becomes crucial, and the tension starts to rise the longer you go without taking a hit. There's a surprising amount of strategy when going for the high score too. What attacks do you avoid altogether, and which do you constantly dash through for that sweet score bonus? How can I utilize my stamina efficiently during this pattern? So on and so forth. While simply beating the bosses only took a few attempts, figuring out how to do it while maximizing my score was a fantastic challenge. My only gripe with the game is its visual style. Don't get me wrong, the game looks great, but some attacks blend into the background a little too much, or get completely overlapped by your attacks. There are some attempts to make them more visible, but when compared to other attacks in the game, the difference is noticeable. Aside from this small hiccup, you can't go wrong with Grimrush. If you liked any of the games I mentioned at the start, scratch that. Especially if you like any of those games, then you should give it a try.